Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. Mark Carney clearly loves a challenge. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, and then governor of the Bank of England during COVID and Brexit. Now he is the UN Special Envoy on climate action and finance, tackling perhaps the biggest challenge of all, climate change. He's encapsulated his views on markets and morals in his book, Values, Building a Better World for Us All. It's a huge mission, but he's determined to try. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Valerie.
You've had some enormous challenges to deal with over the past 15 years, financial crisis, COVID, Brexit. Tackling climate change must be the hardest.
It is the hardest, actually. And it's an interesting challenge because what happens during the day is I get more optimistic during the course of the day because I meet lots of people, or virtually or physically, who are amazing technical experts. So they're coming up with hydrogen fusion, for example. I was talking to someone this morning about that. People who are just rolling out masses of solar and wind energy, part of the solutions. Governments that are getting their act together. People in the financial sector are increasingly focusing on this. So I get more and more enthusiastic, and of course the groundswell from youth around it. And then I get up in the morning and I look at the numbers just in terms of how small our carbon budget globally still is. We're rapidly depleting it. And it's a very, very narrow path for us to accomplish what we're trying to do.
When did the penny drop for you that you went, this isn't working, this isn't sustainable?
Well, I guess the penny really dropped for me was when I became governor of the Bank of England. And one of the parts of that job is to oversee the world's fourth largest insurance industry. That includes Lloyd's of London, which does something called reinsurance. It basically has to pay out if there are huge extreme weather events like massive hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, flooding New York City, droughts in the prairies, etc. And what was happening is the number of those events had been going up about 3 times over the course of the past 25 years. And the cost of those events, because it wasn't just the number, they were more extreme, they were worse droughts, they were bigger hurricanes, had gone up 5 times, adjusted for inflation, of course. And I realized at that point it was an immediate threat to the insurance industry, by extension the financial sector over time, our economy, and that I was one of they.
Mm-hmm. Is that how you engage people? Is it self-interest? Is it property damage? What makes it real for people? Because that's been the problem.
Well, let's take another manifestation of climate change. Over the course of my lifetime, literally the number of animals, species, have gone down by 70%. I mean, it's an absolutely shocking figure. Another figure, over the course of the last year, deforestation has been the size of the Netherlands, the size of Holland. That's absolutely enormous, these shifts. So part of it is to try to make it tangible about just the scale of what's happening, but also to admit that it's only as things have become into the market, if you will, it started to affect things with a price that people have really begun to feel, or at least something approaching a majority of people have begun to feel the immediacy of the problem. And of course, one of the great challenges with climate change is by the time it's obvious to everybody, it's going to be too late to really do something about it.
And also, I guess this balance between everyone goes, well, the government should be doing that. And they have conferences and they make promises. You're focused more on, industry and private sector. Is more innovation drive coming from them than governments, or how does that balance work?
Yeah, well, it takes everybody. That's the first thing. And most of the investment and the innovation will come from the private sector. But of course, the private sector needs governments, and the private sector needs finance in order to fund those innovations. So you need all three. And governments respond to people. So before governments respond, and that is the experience, people tend to be ahead of governments. And so it really, pardon me, does matter that we've had groundswells of interest and passion about sustainability, people changing how they vote, how they consume, what they care about, and then governments start to respond.
I think you were in the General Assembly when Greta Thunberg spoke.
I was.
You know, you have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? Was that like a dagger in your heart?
It was incredibly powerful. I was there, and surrounded by people who, for the most part, were there because they fundamentally cared about this issue. You went into the General Assembly feeling, this is a key issue, but feeling kind of good about yourself.
We're the good guys.
We're on the right side, and you're just, laser hit. And in fairness, laser hit because not enough is being done, which is her point. And she has, the relentless logic of the carbon budget and confidence and of youth. The many contributions that Greta has made, she'll make more, but one of them is just to always bring it back to there's less than 300 gigatons on the carbon budget, and we have less than a decade in order to get our emissions down, and what are you doing about it today that's going to make a difference? Now, we part company on how to do it, how to address that, because in my view, and I'll use the example of the pandemic, we shut our economies down. We got to a position collectively where emissions fell by about 8% over the course of a year. I'll average it to a year. We need to do that year after year after year. Now, we shut down a quarter of our economy. It's not like we're going to shut down half of our economy the next year, 3/4 of the economy the year after. So shrinking our way to address climate change will not work. We have to invest and we have to grow in order to get there. Mm-hmm. And the key thing that I've tried to get across, is to put in some of the building blocks for that investment. But the next point is to get across that one of the key issues is how we value what we value. And if we truly value sustainability, guess what? That shows up in what we're willing to pay for things. That shows up in growth. That shows up in jobs. And that's part of what's changing. We just need to change it faster.
Mm-hmm. You tell a really interesting story anecdote in your book, sort of starts it off in a room with Pope Francis. And his, I don't know, is it a parable?
Yeah, well, it's so we were at a lunch, and he says, look, we're going to start this meal with wine. It's Italy, it's the Vatican after all, so we're starting with wine. Don't do that at the Bank of Canada, to be clear. And wine is many things. It has a bouquet, it has a richness of taste, it has a color, it has alcohol, it enlivens all of our senses. At the end of the meal, we'll have grappa. Grappa is one thing, it's alcohol. It's wine distilled, it's alcohol. Man is many things. Humanity is many things, but he says man is many things. He's rational, he's passionate, he's altruistic, he's self-interested. The market is one thing, it's self-interest. Your job, points to all of us, is to turn the grappa back into wine, the market back into humanity. Discuss. And that's right. Markets don't have values, people do. So how do we organize ourselves so that markets are helping to deliver the values that we as humanity, we as people, really rate? We've been talking about sustainability. It's also solidarity, everyone moving ahead. It's fairness, it's responsibility. But you need that dynamism, in my view, of the market in order to get there.
So it's quite a journey for a guy from Fort Smith,
yes.
Northwest Territories. I mean, you talk about your dad, I think, and your mom giving you a real sort of social conscience underpinning Tell me about them and how did that work?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were up north. I was born, as you say, in the Northwest Territories, and we were there because they were teachers, young teachers, and they felt that was the frontier. That's what needed. It was an adventure, but also it was a higher calling, if you will, to teach in the North and work with First Nations there, and which is what they did. We moved all the way south to Edmonton, which is for many people is about as north as you go, but all the way south to Edmonton, where I spent my most of my school time, all of my school time, I guess. And I remember my dad, he continued to work in what was called the history of education, the philosophy of education. He'd always be going off to social justice workshops, but I've had that sense of the power of community and our ability to constantly improve, basically.
You went off to Harvard. That must have been like, okay, big launch. Harvard, Oxford, Goldman Sachs, a real trajectory, rocket ship success, and then made a choice to do public service, come and work for the Department of Finance in Canada and the Bank of Canada.
For me personally, it was more a question, there was a delayed going to public. I always felt I would go into public service, and after my doctorate, that was my intention. For a variety of reasons, I ended up spending a bit more time in finance, but I really wanted to get back with deliberate. And so when the opportunity came, and David Dodge, who was the then governor, a great Canadian, great economist, global economist, took a chance on me, for which I'm really, really grateful.
There must have been though times, and I was thinking, particularly at the Bank of England, because you're the first foreigner to do that, walking around going like, holy moly,
Yeah.
this is insane. Like, what am I doing here?
Times, like almost virtually all the time, I think.
You went out to schools and said, look, if a clown like me can be governor of the Bank of England, so could you.
Well, and there's a real point to that. I mean, and it's often the advice that's given to younger people. It's the right advice. It's a truism that's true about the importance, as much as possible, of working on things that you're passionate about, that really interest you, people you respect, companies who share your values, or institutions that share your value. And then good things happen. I mean, opportunities open up. I wouldn't have become the governor of the Bank of England, obviously, if I hadn't become the governor of the Bank of Canada. I wouldn't have had that opportunity if I hadn't had a sense of public service from my parents. It didn't mean that I necessarily would get all that, but it led to it. And what's important, I think, in those situations is, remembering who you are, where you're from. I had reminders of Canada, reminders of my Irish heritage. Someone had given me a map of County Mayo, which is where my grandfather was from. And I remember having to get his birth certificate for something once. And his father signed with an X.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you think about, education, the path, and how quickly things can move. And you think about, work on development, work on climate.
That's a story.
Things are possible. Everything's possible, basically.
Tell me about the financial crisis and what you learned and who you learned from. I guess you were dealing with Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke. I mean, it was.
Yeah, it was worse than it looked, without question. The world was the system was collapsing in on itself. Huge ramifications, some of which came to light, others of which were prevented. And I learned a number of things from them. One thing, Ben Bernanke, cool under pressure the entire time. Other people, not always under pressure. You learn a lot about people under pressure. Some of the key things I took away, and is Tim Geithner, who was later the Treasury Secretary, was very senior in the US Fed at the time. Plan beats no plan. Like, when you're in a bad situation, you got to have a plan. Think of Shackleton getting out of Antarctica. Plan beats no plan. Secondly, you need overwhelming force. It doesn't help to do little things and then we'll come back and do more. You need overwhelming force to stop a panic. And ultimately, that can only come from the state. That can only come from government. And all of these, particularly in finance, these markets are ultimately backstopped by the state. And so the challenge as you come out of a situation like that is to leave to the market what should be to the market the risks that they should bear while keeping that underpinning of the state, because in the end, the damage that will be done by the implosion of the financial system. You should never get to that position, but once you're in that crisis, you have to stop it. So that really hit home. It also hit home that we were privatizing gains and socializing losses, so we needed to make sure more of those losses fell on the market. So you need structures where you give people responsibility, institutions, responsibility to take tough decisions early enough so you prevent the bad things. So you push the losses or the consequence early enough onto the financial sector, private financial sector, so the public doesn't face those consequences. And there's an element of that with climate, right? We're bringing forward adjustment, we're bringing forward huge changes that need to happen, or we all will be paying the price.
Mm-hmm. And COVID, COVID was so much about inequality to me. Some people suffered disproportionately at such a level.
Absolutely. It began as a real moment of solidarity. We were, no one was immune. We were all affected by it. The metaphor, we were all in the same storm. But then it turned out we were in different ships, as so often is the case. So the economic cost fell disproportionately on those less well off. The incidence of disease, fell disproportionately. The access initially to vaccines in many cases, and then other treatments, again, unequal access. So it's been, but at a time, at the same point, and this is the stark contrast, where we never valued public services more. We applauding rightly the first responders, the medical profession, the scientists. So we never needed them more. We never had greater solidarity, and yet you had these inequalities. The light shone on the inequalities, and I don't think you can come out of those experiences. It's the same, by the way, with climate. It's the same with the financial crisis. When you have crises, the vulnerable. There'll be some high-profile losses over there, but the vulnerable are affected the worst. They take the hit, and that's why there's a responsibility to do what we can to prevent those crises, and also a responsibility to lean against those impacts and ensure that we truly are all in this together. One of the lessons of economic history is that when we have these big technological revolutions, so the Industrial Revolution being the example, we had universal primary education. The second Industrial Revolution, everyone goes to high school. The computer revolution, 70% of people go to post-secondary. So we need those changes. Pardon me. We're basically going into the fourth Industrial Revolution, AI being the most prominent, but huge changes in genomics, life sciences, huge changes in the green revolution. Great. But recognize that we need better education to respond to that, a lot more mid-career training, lifelong learning. We need a new financial system or new parts of the financial system so that more people have access to cost-effective, cheap, and fair finance, as just two examples. And because the past, we'd sort of wait half a century before those things started to change. And there's a lot of damage that's done over that period. Instead, we can do a lot of good over the course of the next, I would say, 25, 50 years.
If we accelerate it.
If we accelerate it, we recognize it, we make some of the changes that we're already doing.
Because yes, the long-term stuff, you've got to fight pessimism, and that's
sometimes fight pessimism.
Bill Gates said something like zero carbon in a decade is a fairy tale.
Yeah, well, I think what what Bill Gates has done though on climate is he's very effectively divided up the solutions. These are the things we can roll out at scale today. So wind and solar, hydropower if you have it, maybe nuclear as part of the solution. You know, it's cost effective today, we can invest in it, and this is what we should be doing now. Now I, Bill Gates, and a bunch of other very smart people are going to focus on the technologies we're going to need next decade. So hydrogen, small modular reactors, direct air capture, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Some people focused on fusion, other breakthrough technologies, to use his terminology. And we're going to put money behind those so that when we get to the end of the decade, those will be ready to be built out at large scale. And so he's not nihilistic at all. He's very practical. And it just shows that we need everything. You know, we need people. Yes, we do need windmills, but we're not going to solve. And you know, the UK, when I went there, it was is not because of me, but 10% of power generation from wind. It's now 40%. It'll be the majority. Yeah, 40% on average is from offshore wind. Wind as a whole for the UK, of the generation UK. It's absolutely. I think it's underappreciated. Just the scale of change that's going on. You know, when you're in an inflection point, it's hard to see. After the fact, of course, it's very obvious because the lines go up. We're absolutely in an inflection point on addressing climate change. Doesn't mean we're going to, we can relax and we're going to definitely get there, but it does mean we have a shot.
You've expressed an interest in politics. How are you going to be able to tell when the time is right? I mean, the climate, just the conditions, I don't know.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is having been around politics and policy in various ways, I can see how powerful, how essential it is, and how powerful it can be when it's focused on the real issues, the issues that are going to affect people today, but very much build a better and fairer country for tomorrow. So I'm interested in that. The question is, how do you influence it? You influence it with ideas, you influence it with building some of the building blocks, or do you influence it, do you go on the front line? And the front line, those, opportunities come up rarely, maybe not at all. I think the important thing is to, at least if you're someone like me, is to always be trying to contribute and certainly not keeping your ideas to yourself, solutions that you think might work, helping anyone who asks to the extent you can. And that's basically the way I approach it.
And the jobs that you do and what you want to focus on, do you feel your plate is full now?
Yeah, my plate's pretty full. I mean, I'm UN Special Envoy. I like saying that. Not just an envoy, special envoy on climate. $1 a year. They owe me $3. Don't work for the UN, or someone donate to the UN so they can pay their special envoys. Look, that is a huge privilege responsibility. It's a sort of undefined role, defined objective, but undefined role, how you do it. So I focus on helping to organize the financial sector, so as we put it, so that every financial decision takes climate change into account. Sometimes it's decisive, sometimes it's just of interest, but always thinks about how this investment, how this loan, does it bring us closer to that goal or farther away?
You spend a chapter in your book on humility, which isn't a word most people would assign to politicians, central bankers, big, important people.
Yeah, I mean, I try to go through in the book, some of the core values. We've talked about a number of them, but I think humility always does come in. And to be clear, humility doesn't mean to be passive in the end. We shouldn't be incapacitated by humility. But humility, if I'm a central banker, a risk manager, I'm thinking about, well, what can go wrong? Recognize and plan for failure, literally plan for failure, so that when these shocks happen, climate, COVID, financial, you're ready for it.
The final question for these interviews is always, what does being Canadian mean to you?
Well, I think it means virtually everything we've talked about when I think about it. No disrespect to my Fort Smith, but I start from relatively humble beginnings. Sense of perseverance, which was the town motto. Sense of community. I'm the beneficiary of public education, public health care, public attitudes. A real sense of being in it together. And of course, Canada's the world, right? The world is in Canada, and yet we're all Canadian and have that shared sense. So, it means, pretty much means everything, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It's been
you,
a pleasure
Valerie.
talking to you.
My pleasure.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of David and Cheryl Carr, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, Michael McCain and family, Jim and Sandra Pitbledo, Tony and Sherry Fell, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Charles and Marilyn Bailey, Richard Pilasoff, Clench House Foundation, Kathy and George Dombrowski, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.